afternoon and good morning, everybody, and welcome here to this event presentation of our research on China and the rest of the world. Specifically, this will be devoted to China after zero COVID. This was intended to be the major issue of discussion related to how China should be, Europe should be rethinking its strategy vis-à-vis China. Then we know that we have been collecting some major disruptions, more than COVID. So policy-induced disruptions and war-induced disruptions. So COVID is in good company. So we have much more to discuss, I think. This is why we have invited a number of our foreign colleagues from Asia and Europe, very knowledgeable on many issues, and we will draw from their experiences and insights. The event is organized together with, by the way, other think tanks which we are collaborating with since quite a long time, and we want to secure future collaboration. One is Real Istituto Elcano, Royal Institute, from where our Miguel Otero is coming, and the Center for China and Globalization as well, and also the event and the report just published online a couple of hours ago, I think, on the Indo-Pacific issue and strategy was sponsored by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we thank for their support. We have two panels today, two sessions. One I will be moderating, and we are very happy to have two colleagues in person here. Françoise Nicolas from IFRI, Director of the Center for Asian Studies at the French Institute of International Relations. Welcome back, Françoise. And Miguel Otero Iglesias from Real Istituto Elcano, Senior Analyst. And we have two more panelists from Asia. Now we see on the screen, welcome, Huiyao Wang. Can you hear us? Welcome.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for being with us. Founder and president of the Center on China and Globalization, co-hosting the event. And last but not least, I hope she can hear us, although she's traveling somewhere to get a good connection. Alicia Garcia Herrero, senior fellow at Bruegel and chief economist for Asia at Natixis from Taipei, I think. So
yes.
Maybe, yes, okay.
Thanks,
Alicia.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Maybe we can see you later. So the session is kind of challenging and demanding because one of the major issues under discussion is whether China is, so to say, back on track, on a path we were used to or not, and which are the major bottlenecks or challenges. Of course, we are not scrutinizing. I mean, everybody has gone and is going through major challenges and disruptions. So we are on the same boat, as we say, maybe in Italy or maybe in other languages as well. So discussing about China going back and facing challenges is not to be considered as a way to finger point China, because we are all facing maybe not similar, but very severe challenges. So the discussion is open to insights and opinions, but trying to get a constructive view and opinion to get along in the future due to the major disruptions that are actually combining one to the other, which is, I think, the major trouble. So I would reshuffle a little bit the order compared to the program because of, connection problems. So I would ask Françoise to start the panel. Maybe Françoise, everybody's asking whether China is sailing into uncharted territory for her future, and what are your insights on this, please?
Okay, does that work first? Yes, it does? Okay. Yeah, first of all, well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for having me back in Milan. It's been a long time. I was actually there a month ago, but it had been some time before, so it's good to be back. Well, I'll be addressing this China issue, but before I do that, I guess that everybody in this room knows that there is no such a thing as a one-handed economist. You know, with economists, it's always on the one hand and on the other hand. So as a result, I'm an economist, and so as a result, my response to your question, is China back, will not be a clear-cut answer. It will be on the one hand, on the other hand answer, kind of. So the first thing is that you cannot really respond to this question very clearly. The reason being that it all depends, it's again something that economists always say, it depends. It gives you some time to think, first thing, and then you're never wrong when you say that. So it depends on which metrics you use, it depends on which time horizon you consider, it depends on a number of things. So in the case of China, the first thing to consider is the time horizon. If we look at the short term, I would tend to be relatively optimistic. And if you look at the recent data, well, China is definitely back on track. Growth has been quite significant in the first quarter of this year, even higher than initially anticipated. So that's pretty good. Of course, you have to qualify this optimistic stance immediately. It's not all that surprising that the growth is back, because the situation was so bad last year that there is some low base effect. You know, when you go very, very far down the drain, of course it's quite easy to pick up and recover. So there is a little bit of that in the case of China, and this explains why the growth figures in the first part of this year were quite good, but it doesn't, I think, tell much. What is, I guess, more important is to look at the drivers behind this growth. And the drivers are, to a large extent, consumption. So if we look at the reason why this growth was quite strong, it's all about, well, to a large extent about consumers. And even then, the messages are a little bit mixed. It all depends what kind of consumption you look at again. So if we look at the detailed data, what we see is that all sectors have not performed in the same way. We see, for instance, that catering or dinners, this type of stuff, all this did very well, but some other sectors didn't do as well. So there was definitely a very strong growth in travel and meals, and this was quite obvious at the time of the Chinese New Year. But it's not all that clear in other sectors. For instance, apparently movie theaters are not doing as well. So it is, again, very, well, you have to be quite nuanced in the way you look at things. Perhaps another important metrics or indicator is inflation. And what we see is that there is no inflationary pressure in China, unlike what we observe in our own countries, and particularly in at least. I don't know what the situation in Italy, but in France I can tell you that inflation is quite high and everybody is badly hit. So this is not the case in China, which would suggest that precisely there is no mismatch between consumption or demand and supply. There is not very, very strong demand pushing prices up. So again, this is something that we have perhaps to ponder a little bit. So domestic demand still seems inadequate to push prices up. And this has certainly something to do with Chinese incomes. And this is another thing that has to be checked. And apparently incomes are not back on track. And some people argue that, well, perhaps the demand is not all that strong right now, but there is a lot of pent-up demand. Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that, precisely because the incomes have been badly hit by by the protracted period of lockdowns, and people are no longer able to, unlike what happens in a country like France, during the lockdown, people saved because they didn't have to spend so much money because they were protected by the authorities. In China, there was not such a thing. So people saved like mad. And nowadays, they have these savings, but for other purposes than consumption. So I'm not sure that there is so much of pent-up demand left in China. So all this to say that short-term, the picture is relatively good, but it has to be qualified immediately. As far as unemployment is concerned, by the way, the figures are quite alarming, in particular about youth unemployment. And again, this is something that is a little bit worrying as well. Now, how much time do oh yeah, I have some more time. Okay. So now if we look at the longer term perspective, things are quite different and even less rosy than the short term perspective. The first thing is that, industrial production is still rather weak. And this is particularly true in the car industry, for instance. Investment is also not doing terribly well, which is another big issue. I mean, it used to be a major driver of growth, and this is no longer the case. And there are, besides this, more structural issues and more structural or serious headwinds that China has to face. Among these headwinds, I would point to the widening gap in government budgets, revenue lagging and spending rising. There is also a slow motion housing crash, I think we can call it this way, and this remains definitely a drag on the economy. There is another problem, which is even more structural, and which will be with China for a long time, and this is the shrinking and rapidly aging population. So this is something that China will have to address, and this is not something that can be changed easily. And what we see is that all the efforts that the government has been trying to put in place to push people to have more kids, all these efforts have been in vain so far. So there has been a relaxation of the one-child policy for quite some time. Now they're pushing for the second kid, and now they're even pushing for the third kid. But the second kid is not yet there, so there won't be any third kid. So that's really a problem, and I think this has to do, again, back to what I was saying before. It has certainly something to do with the incomes and with confidence in the population in the future. So that's really a problem. And another issue also is productivity growth, which is not as strong as it should be. So a number of the standard or usual drivers of growth, productivity, labor accumulation, capital accumulation, all three are in relatively bad shape, and this is really an issue in the from a longer-term perspective. So all this doesn't point to very good prospects for China. As you rightly said, China is not the only country which is in this type of situation, but since we are discussing China, that's what I would like to say about China. One last point is, all right, well, all this is very nice, but what does that mean? What does that imply for China's position, place, and strategy in the global economy and in the world at large? And here again, I think that it depends, and you can argue both ways. One first conclusion that you may draw from what I said is that since China is having many problems, it will tend to focus on its own domestic issues and will not venture as much abroad as it used to. So that's one first possible interpretation of the current situation or of the future situation. That's one possibility. Another possibility is precisely to say, well, far to the contrary, Since China is having domestic problems, one way of solving these problems is precisely to venture abroad, to precisely try to solve these problems through other ways, which are not domestic ways, but which are external ways. And it's actually what China has been trying to do with the Belt and Road Initiative 10 years ago. The reason why China engaged in this or embarked in this strategy was precisely to address some domestic issues like overcapacities in particular. So you can argue both ways. It can either push China to venture abroad more resolutely, or the current situation may, far to the contrary, push China to stay home and to focus exclusively on its domestic issues. Well, personally, I would tend to stand kind of in the middle, in between these two extremes. And what I would tend to argue is that the current situation is probably pushing China to still venture abroad, but probably to recalibrate or revise its strategy. So as a result, I don't think that China will be back anytime soon exactly the way it was before the crisis, before the COVID, and before all these various events that we went through over the past couple of years. It will be back in the global economy. It will be active, but in a different way. And probably this recalibration of in particular of the Belt and Road Initiative, is a revision of this strategy. So it will not be exactly the same Belt and Road as what we saw 2 or 3 years ago. Or until 2 or 3 years ago. And China will still be active, but in different way, and probably less through heavy investments, for instance. So there will be a revision or recalibration of Chinese activities on the global stage. So I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Françoise, for touching upon a number of issues which we will still discuss in the next few minutes. Let me say just only one thing related to the, expectations of China's stance in the global economy. I think both inward and outward orientation will be there. Maybe a more selective outward orientation, which will be impacting on very differently on different areas of the world. And this is related to Belt and Road, becoming something a little bit different compared to 10 years ago. And also the more economic issues that you tackle, so incomes which are not back, may actually lead to import weakness, which we may see already, and Europe may be, impacted on this, from this. And also consumption over time, which is, being also an economist, may be very boring. They are, because they keep asking things that nobody can answer. But anyway, consumption over time is very difficult to inspect, because you have a lot of research suggesting that when, masses of population reach the retirement age, two things can happen, and they are opposite. Either they spend because they are, they are saving, they are not saving anymore, so they spend the pension and the saving of their working lives, or they save for the next generation. So, but ex ante, we cannot say. It depends on the system, on the culture, also it's two hands again. But it's not necessarily negative, because it could be that more consumption when people retire actually shows up somehow. So thanks again for this. So now, may I leave the floor to Miguel to maybe follow up on whichever issue you want to cover among the many that we raised now. Thanks, Miguel.
Thanks. It's great to be here, really. Thanks for the invitation. It's my first time actually at ISPI. So, I'm very honored to be here, and as well that Elcano is collaborating in this event, which is very timely, I think. And Françoise said that economists, they always have two hands. political economists usually, would answer any question by saying that, well, it's rather complex. And so, I will kind of delve in this complexity by covering some of the economic, but as well economic diplomacy and more statecraft topics that I think are relevant for the question of whether China is back. I think, I would agree with what Françoise really said, both on the short and long term, both on kind of the positive results from the first quarter and the outlook for this year. In principle, I think the IMF thinks that China will again be, contributing 1/3 to the overall growth of the world economy this year, which is a common pattern in the past. But as Françoise said, there are many important challenges. One is the income levels, and as Françoise very well explained, it's very different than here in Europe, even in the United States, where people could save or had support from the state. That's not the case in China, and that's maybe why the optimists were not as accurate in when they thought that when China would open its economy back from the zero COVID policy, that it would be much stronger bounce back, and I think so. Confidence and trust in China is not strongly there as some thought. And Françoise alluded to it briefly, but I think this is very relevant, because I think it's rather new, as far as I know, that you have now youth unemployment that is reaching 20%. So between 16 and 24-year-olds in China, a lot of them university graduates, they're coming out, and so 1 out of 5 doesn't find a job, which is very, very, very unique, and it could produce certain unrest or certain kind of critique to the government that we might have not seen in the past. And then, I think I agree broadly with the structural problems of the Chinese economy. There's a debate really on the real estate, whether this was induced or not, whether actually this is a soft landing. Françoise said it was a slow motion crash. I might tend to look more on the kind of given the dimension of the bubble that China had, that if you don't really have major shocks, it would be rather soft landing, because the challenge of bursting that bubble was always to be immense. And then this leads me to really at the heart of the political economy, which is how China deals with its excessive debt and very high debt levels, and how it restructures. And it is in the process of restructuring, kind of at the provincial level, at the national level, between kind of the construction side and the citizens that have that bought their houses, etc. So it's a very complex. That's really the debt restructuring aspect of China. It's very complex, which in a way connects as well with China's debt restructuring negotiations abroad as well, mainly in Africa, that are very important and lead me in a way to to this economic diplomacy. China in many ways is back. In regards to answering the question, I would say China is definitely back, because China has been inward looking and close to the world and not as active and present in world affairs because of COVID, and it is definitely back. Now the question is whether it's back with positive outlooks, with negative outlooks, how people perceive China. I think broadly the perceptions of China across the world have deteriorated with COVID. In Europe in particular, with the Ukraine war as well. And obviously there is the big issue that maybe it's most of the structural issues that is facing China, and that Françoise didn't touch upon, which is US-China rivalry, right? I mean, that is affecting obviously China, on all fronts, domestic, economic, political, international relations, etc. And there, we can see that, following up from what I was just saying, the importance of possible debt restructuring in Africa. I think this is a major topic right now in the global agenda. Tensions between the United States and China. The United States wanting China to be part of this debt restructuring. China, in many ways, using this opportunity to demand that the multilateral development banks get some haircuts as well, and at the same time asking for a reform of this, multilateral development banks and the IMF, etc. And so China there being back, and for some being not too constructive, and for others, having the legitimacy to ask for kind of haircuts as well from the multilateral development banks, because they are major stakeholders in this process, and especially as well the private sector being involved in that. And then, of course, we have China coming back in terms of both its diplomats visiting, especially Europe. We have seen this. And that is as well a mixed picture, I would say, right? I mean, Wang Yi's intervention in the Munich Security Conference was perceived in Europe as not very constructive. A lot of critique to the United States, calling upon the Europeans to not follow the United States, to separate themselves from the United States in this kind of deterrence and contention strategy in regards to China. And in the context of the Ukraine war, the Europeans, especially of course the Central and Eastern Europeans, not very happy about this message, right? The Central and Eastern Europeans very critical about China's stand in this particular conflict. Then of course we had all these visits from the Europeans, my Prime Minister among them, Scholz before, and then Macron and von der Leyen. We can talk about that. Here again, I mean, it shows that China is very interesting, and despite all these tensions that are there, and that we have von der Leyen talking about de-risking and a much tougher discourse on China, we see that especially at the national level there is still the desire to kind of do business with China, to get contracts done with China. For example, in my country we are very eager to have again Chinese tourists coming back, and that was one of the big topics in Pedro Sanchez's visit to China. But even like seeing the opportunities of perhaps even Chinese investment in a possible battery factory in Spain. So and Macron went with Airbus contracts and 50 CEOs that followed him. So. We have Fukong, the new ambassador in Brussels, doing, I believe, good work in terms of presenting China as the partner that it should be in this triad that we see it in Europe. But then you have as well, of course, the recent comments by the ambassador of China to France, Lu Xiaoye, that in many ways undermined a lot of this charming, the charming strategy that China has been developing over the past months, and that, of course, received very fierce critique both in Europe, not only in Eastern and Central Europe, but of course as well in the United States, saying that the Baltic countries don't have sovereignty, and so that's highly problematic. We have, but then again, we have the recent visit of Wang Wentao, the Minister of Commerce, met Dombrovskis, and we have now the restitution of the high-level dialogue on the economic and trade relations. So in many ways, my feeling, and this is just to sum up, by the way, that He Lifeng, so the Vice Premier, will be actually chairing that high-level dialogue. So again, China trying to to put the big shots there for Europe. But my sense is that China is still finding its place. Somehow my sense is that it wanted to go back to business, but realized that Europe is now in a very different context, and things have changed considerably. But as well, kind of, we see that where China, beyond Europe, Tehran-Saudi Arabia deal, now the talk between Xi Jinping and Zelensky. I was recently at the Raisina dialogue as well, and the Chinese plan, and in India was in, well, the Chinese had the plan. What is the European plan for peace? So I think in the global south, I think China is definitely back, and perhaps it is seen in better eyes, or more positive eyes, than we do that here in Europe. I think for a start. That's
yes,
what I wanted
definitely,
to say.
Miguel. You listed so many issues and points that would deserve, on their own a discussion. But let me just say that, China is navigating maybe one of the most difficult oceans, on Earth, because of course times are changing for everybody. But in Asia, the speed is much faster as usual. So also the challenges are piling up faster than what we may perceive. So I think I can say, but this is a personal note, not only a professional one, that after some 30 years or so that we have been studying China, we have developed full confidence on the capacity of the Chinese government to handle whatever, because this is what happened so far. So regardless of what we may, list about the challenges and the difficulties and the bottlenecks, the capacities of handling multiple and severe situations has been proven. So, this is kind of a note to, inspire a constructive discussion. This is my personal now in mid-panel hint. So thanks, Miguel. Now we move to our online speakers. We are very sad you are not here with us, but we can see you and we will appreciate your contribution. I would suggest Alicia goes first, not only because ladies first, but also because I would like Huiyao to end the discussion. Being the only Chinese speaker, I would like him to, sum up and give his own perspective, which I think is, appropriate. So, Alicia, if you are ready and you can hear us, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alessia. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, go ahead.
Good. So I would like to thank ISPI for the invitation. It's really a pleasure. This is not my first time. It's one of the very many, and it's always extremely interesting. I have to say that most of what I wanted to say has already been said, which makes my intervention difficult, but the good news, it'll be short. I want to focus on basically dwelling with the challenges, why we should not, as you said, Alessia, underestimate China's ability to recover from any challenge, and aware of the challenges that Françoise has mentioned, and certainly I would go a little bit beyond, and I will explain what I mean. I still think that China's resilience is simply amazing. And it is a very important thing for Europeans to learn from, but also react to. And I'll explain these three things. So let me go first through dwelling through the challenges from a different perspective, or perhaps just focusing slightly differently in those challenges. So it's been mentioned that China's finances, I think Françoise mentioned that, are very difficult. Indeed, they are. I just landed from Tokyo today. They're even harder in Japan. And we tend to believe that, notwithstanding China's rapidly accumulated debt, China still has a lot of fiscal room. This is kind of the general belief. I would argue that China has very little fiscal room. And this is important for the rest of the world, because we can't forget that China has brought the global economy back to back to its feet in several occasions, including right at the first phase of COVID, from March, where the global economy was at its knees, and of course 2008. Can China do this again? Of course, COVID second part of 2020 was not really fiscal, but 2008 was fiscal. 2016 was fiscal. This was the famous G20, China-led G20, and we're getting out of this hole, the 2015, second half of 2015 hole. China did all of that. But beyond China's abilities, which nobody denies, the fiscal space was there. And the fiscal space is no longer there. And again, to make a comparison with Japan, I just want to offer a number here. So China's GDP per capita today, about $12,000 per capita, is once upon a time that of Japan, obviously. That Japan in the 80s had debt, which was only 40, public debt, obviously, 40% of GDP, 225 today. So if you imagine China's debt today at those $12,000 per capita, and I'm not going to offer official figures, I'm afraid, but those that the IMF reports, which is about 100%, including local government financial vehicles, but I'm going to go beyond, because that number does not include state-owned enterprises. And we know of course, we don't know how many assets they could divest, but that's not something that Chinese SOEs have done for many years. We need to go back to Ronji to imagine something like that. So if you just look at the liabilities, that would hover around 200% of GDP, from 40 in Japan to 200. So China's fiscal space is really not there. And therefore, whatever China manages to do will have to come from productivity, from innovation. It's no longer demand policies. They have some space on the monetary side. I think Chinese interest rates will go down aggressively over the years to allow for that debt sustainability, but there is a limit, as we all know, and I don't think the PBOC wants to be stuck like the BOJ at this current juncture. So the limit is there, even in terms of monetary policy. It will take a couple of years, 3 years maybe, to reduce all of the excess reserves, the reserve requirement ratio, lower rates, but it's going to come to an end. So it's a question of time. And then finally, on aging, the impact on aging today is not so massive as it could be, for a very simple reason, because China is still urbanizing. And therefore, the reduction, the actual depopulation that we see in China basically affects the least productive part of the country, which is the rural areas. That's where you have -5% population growth nowadays. But as urbanization ends, that reduction in population, depopulation, is going to affect the most productive part of the Chinese economy, the cities. So it's going to be much more costly. We've estimated this to be from 2035 onwards. So what can China do to avoid all of this? Innovate, innovate, innovate. How good are the news? Well, if you look at the actual final output, total factor productivity, stagnant. If we look at the input to that output, meaning patents, R&D expenditure, very positive. So, the question is it too early or is it not working? And I don't have an answer. I'm sorry, Françoise, I'm going to be on the one hand and the other hand, but I'm going to be humble. I don't know whether China's search of innovation will work out in terms of productivity. But I only can tell you one thing. China's maintain R&D to expand, which is around slightly more than Europe or Japan, less than the US, much less than South Korea, it will be very hard. And the reason is very simple. It's because the fiscal space isn't there. And 2/3 of that R&D comes from the government. So I hope, actually, for the sake of China's future and the world, that this can happen, because we don't want a very rapid deceleration of the Chinese economy. Nobody wants that. But this is really the challenge. Part on the long term, why I think we need to be cautious on what we expect from China's structural growth. But I want to end by saying that if we take a rather moderate scenario, I mean, these numbers have been offered by the NDRC and the World Bank years ago, even, I mean, basically 2013, 14, they were prepared, published in 2015, I believe. So basically, even before China had to deal with US containment, technological containment, you name it, let alone other factors bringing down structural growth, such as, of course, a much faster accumulation of debt because of COVID and other factors. So already then, the expectation, without major reforms, that's what the NDRC said, and the World Bank, would be for China to hover around 2.5% by 2035. So what we are going to see is an economy which is going to be huge, but basically of the size of the US. And China is not going to outpace the US or in terms of GDP size, because it's going to grow basically about the same for the foreseeable future. And that means that the current rivalry is there to stay for all of us, including Europe. So we'd better get used to it, because there's no reason, unless one of the two economies were to really at least be 50% bigger than the other, we wouldn't see anything like that, in my view, with the projections I shared with you, anytime soon, basically in the next decades. And who knows what's going to happen next? It could be, anything. Yeah, civil war in the US. I mean, I'm of course abstracting from any major disruption, whether it's Taiwan, but in a baseline scenario, that's where we will be. And I think that's very bad news for Europe, because basically we're going to be stuck in that situation. For some reason, my video is not working, but I hope you heard what I said, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thanks, Alicia. Yes, we could hear you 95% of the time very well. So thanks. And we heard that we are stuck. And maybe we didn't want to hear that, but well, very well. We should get used to it and maybe do something about it, which is, I think, the real challenge. Thanks for your pragmatism, as usual. Maybe out of the very, I would say impossible narratives about whichever scenario of, two different worlds apart from one another building up, which is, I think, nonsense, because Europe is nowhere in there, neither on the west nor on the east, so that is not going to happen. So thanks for being very pragmatic and constructive and inspiring as usual. And last but not least, I would give the floor, finally to Huiyao. I realize it must be very difficult to hear everybody in the world talk about one's own country, not being Chinese. So I'm very sympathetic with you, that you have to hear everybody, discussing about your own fate. So it must be difficult. So the floor is yours now. We have been, covering many issues, and we are happy to hear your views and your comments about what we see from here about China, because we are very much interested in, understanding, really. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, great. Great. Thank you, Alicia, and also co-panelists. Very stimulating discussion, and also thank for the opportunity to co-host this event. I think that if you ask the question whether China is back, I would say China is largely back. Is back for sure. I mean that's quite obvious. We have the numbers. Of course, you see, the first quarter results has come out, and the trade has gone up, and the GDP has gone up, and all the numbers has gone up. So and even the IMF, World Bank, and quite a few investment banks has highly projected China's growth for this year. Definitely, I mean, after 3 years of closing down, after devastated by the COVID, you cannot switch around. I mean, like 1 million. You need some boot time. You need some startup or warm up phrase. So I think China is exactly in that kind of phase, because there's still, I mean, the things like international flights has not resumed to its full capacity before pandemic, and also of course, the tourism hasn't really come back to 100% as we expecting. So I think that you need to give some boot time for that. But I was traveling in China, for the last 2-3 months. I've been to all kind of conferences, China Development Forum, Bruegel Forum, Understanding China. I mean, I've been traveling, China Global Talent Forum in Shenzhen, and all the rest. I mean, first time I found everything. Whenever I get out of the airport, you have to line up. There's a queue for taxis and DD and things like that. So the airport gets very busy, crowded, and many times, and traffic is also starting to jam in Beijing on the street. So you can see, activities is coming back. I mean, also theaters is moviegoers also gone up too. There's a lot of things that are really in the speed. What I actually can see is that certainly China take a bit more time to really fully recover. But again, I would just say that China has been handling things very well. You can see how quickly China switched around from zero COVID to now no COVID. Basically, it's very, very effective, and it's not as bad as people thought. And also, we talk about international investment, trade, and all the international activities. You see the parade of foreign government leaders. There's so much, people coming. I mean, just for CCG, our think tank, we have received a number of foreign ministries from other countries. From Belgium, from Netherlands, and from Slovenia. Many countries actually. It's all quite busy, and I'm glad to see actually European leaders now coming. Largely, we have Spanish Prime Minister coming. Actually, was supposed to make a speech at our think tank. Couldn't do it. It's too short. But Bruegel was scheduled to deliver a speech at our think tank. He had COVID, couldn't come, but he published a speech to be delivered at the CCG. So which is quite more positive now. And so I see the mood and the tune has changed somewhat. And I see a kind of G3 is China, US, and EU. Finally, it's not China versus West, or West versus the rest. It's kind of have some kind of independence, at least economically. So EU is not really going to decouple. We heard de-risk. Okay, de-risk. I mean, everybody wants to avoid risk. That's understandable, and the same is true for China. So I think that all those are fine. But again, we see a lot of business people are starting to come back. For China Development Forum, you had 70 CEOs. For Macron, you have 60 CEOs. For the Brazilian president who came just a while ago, had 250 CEOs with him. So all business people. So you can see there's a huge interest for people to come back to take a look. But once they came here, they were totally amazed by the efficiency and effectiveness, because the synergy is there. The train runs on time, and everywhere you go, well-connected Wi-Fi and connectivity. There's 5 to 6 million 5G, 4G stations in China. Everywhere you go is very well powered up by the digital economy. So what I think is actually China is quickly realized, at least by European companies, this is a great market because China is soon going to have a 500 million middle class, the largest middle class in the world, in the making. And of course also, that we talk about the demographic population dividend, but China is turning that into talent dividend. China graduates about 11.5 million college graduates, plus another 500,000 returnees and things like that. They were talking about China diminishing its, last year, first time they had a negative growth of the population, about 400,000. But I think, that is probably understandable because 3 years of COVID, a lot of vaccine, nobody wants to have babies, and you have a little bit declines. It's understandable. But I think in the long run, this talent dividend will continue, and China has 240 million college-educated people among its 900 million working population, which probably is the largest number of college-educated graduates in any other country in the world. So China would have abundant, highly skilled working forces available, and China, the train runs on time. There's no strikes. It's very attractive for foreign investment to come to China, and highly effective. And also the new government is functioning. You have a new cohort of state council, minister, governors. I mean, they all geared up to make China things happen. Certainly, there is a problem there. I'm sure there's problem, some here and there. But overall, if they can keep the stability, if they can keep the things not disrupted, if they can keep the all the supply and demand in relatively good shape, and there could be a debt issue somewhere. There could be problem, but I think the government has deep pockets to absorbing that. But you don't have a confidence crisis in China. There's no bank run. I mean, like what you see in the Western countries sometimes. So I think in that sense, there may be a bit of China may be not good at 0 to 1, but China is very good at 1 to 100. So that is really this largest application of digital market. You have 1.2 billion smartphone users. You got all the things are working very well. So I think that China would be doing fine, and China has is micro tuning its economy, and there's a lot of adjustment. Private sector, I think since the Premier League came up, he has really emphasized quite a few times on the private sectors, the issue, the private, encouragement of private investment. So I think there's some confidence on back. But also there may be some entrepreneurs leaving China. But if they want to make money, they still have to stay in China. So that's where things will back to normal, I think, from time. The biggest worry, of course, is geopolitical situation. We should avoid this, deteriorating of Sino-US relations. I'm glad Premier Li will visit Germany pretty soon. We probably will also expecting Italian Prime Minister to visit China. So let's hope the high-level dialogue is continued, and I hope that U.S. The high level, Yellen or the Secretary of Commerce or even Blinken can visit China. China now is also helping to be more actively engaged into the international affairs. China is talking to both President Putin and President Zelensky. China is going to send an envoy to, both countries to break a peace. So I think China is getting more active. I wouldn't worry too much about the stability. As long as China keep the stability, things will probably doing fine. I'm going to have a dialogue with Joseph Nye tomorrow. We are just publishing a new book for him in English and Chinese, and he said maybe there's a 20-year cycle. You have 20 years contained China and 20 years opening up, and maybe we'll have another 20 years. But he expect by 2035 or somewhere, we may reach a new equilibrium. We will accept each other. We will have to live along with each other. We cannot, we cannot really afford to have a fight or war. I really don't think that is the way to go. So I think EU is really important. Can play a balance between China and the US, and that's where you get the best of the two worlds. And that's, I think, this discussion today is really good, that we can explore how EU can be more active in making the G3 work and also Global South do better. So thank you very much.
Huiyao, for your inputs, and well, it's in everybody's interests, not only China's, that China reaches and is heading to a stable, path, whichever it means. We don't know, nobody knows. We are also heading somewhere. But this, I think, brings us to the beginning of our discussion, because, of course, exogenous disruptions piled up, but what worries maybe most now is policy-induced disruptions that may, add to that and, force the course of things towards unsustainable directions. And this is up to policymakers. So let's hope to inspire at least a little bit with our work. So I think we are running out of time for the session. So if there's no question from the audience, a couple of minutes only, I am willing to take at least one. Yes, Jagannath, you have a, yes? Okay.
Thank you very much. Excellent panel and some insightful remarks. Just a very broad questions. Anyone can, take up these questions. We have been talking about the new supply chain networks. Is China a part of it, not a part of it? How should we maintain that balance? Is it really possible to talk a new supply chain realistically without China? How effective it is going to be? Some thoughts about this would be really meaningful. Thank you.
Well, this is the question. Any? Françoise, you want to start?
Okay, I can start. Well, again, it depends. So it depends what kind of sector you're talking about or you're thinking of. For some sectors, I guess there is no way that you can get rid of China or that you can decouple from China. And there is no reason to actually think of decoupling from China. And so what I have in mind here are all the goods that are considered not to be strategic. So in this, for this kind of stuff, well, China will still be part of the chain and the other countries will also be part of the chain. Everybody will be happy. So this is one set of activities in which we will still be in a logic of globalization. So it's not the end of globalization, and I don't think that anybody would argue that it should be the end of globalization. For some other goods which are deemed strategic, critical, this is a different story. And so for this kind of goods, what we are precisely thinking of in Europe is about, well, de-risking, is about diversification of partners in a supply chain. And for some of these goods, well, reducing the part of China may be an option. And this is what is hidden, I guess, behind this de-risking thing, this idea of this concept of de-risking. So again, it all depends on what you have in mind, what kind of sector you are talking about. So that's what I can say. But Miguel, if you want to add something.
No, I mean, I completely agree. I think perhaps another element is that there might be supply chains in China. So you are in China, for the Chinese market, and then you have more transnational supply chains that are outside China. So this is part of the diversification strategy. And I think that's the way to go. And the last sentence is, de-risking sounds all very nice, but it is easier said than done. It's going to be an immense, because even in strategic sectors, for example, I mean, I think it is now obvious that, as we are dependent on the United States in our digital transition, we are highly dependent on China in our energy transition. And that will be with us for a long time, really. Because we don't really want to mine in Europe a lot of this rare earths, for example, right? We don't really have the willingness to accept this level of kind of pollution, perhaps, or work that needs to be done, right? And so there will be still a lot of reliance on China, even in strategic sectors.
Yeah, but perhaps one more thing. I think that after the various crises that we went through over the past couple of years, there is one thing that is for sure, is that we will not go back to the globalization in the way it was organized before COVID, before all the various crises. I guess, and interestingly, some economists had argued against this kind of globalization, saying or arguing that this type of globalization had gone too far. And I'm thinking in particular of Danny Roderick, who argued along these lines. And I think indeed it was a mistake to think that you can, outsource everything. And it was a mistake to offshore too many things, too many productions in China. At the end of the day, as a result of this offshoring, excessive offshoring, you ended up being extremely vulnerable. And this is what was realized during the COVID pandemic. But it was also realized at some point, with regards to the rare earth production, for instance. China ended up having a monopoly on rare earth production, not because China is the only place where you find rare earth. It's not the case. I mean, rare earths are all over the place. But we, the West, if we can, and there is such a thing, we chose to let China produce this rare earth because it was dirty, polluting. Okay, well, let's have this rare earth produced in China. We don't want that on our soil. And that was a mistake. And there were a number of other things which were organized exactly in this way. So I think that at the end of the day, this kind of globalization has definitely come to an end. And so as a result, there won't be a supply chains the way they were organized before COVID and before all the mess that we've been through.
Thanks. Let me jump in before giving the floor to our two speakers online. Well, two minor points. I think there is divergence in attitude, at least, between US and EU. The US are figuring out how to decouple, as they say, and Europe is figuring out how not to have to decouple. So this is a major difference. And it's very instructive and inspiring that the question comes from India, right? Because India will be the new player in whatever globalization will become, the new pattern. For sure, it is already. So that is one major point to be inspected, I think, because of course there's been already reshuffling within Asia, but India is becoming a major player for value chains. But it all depends on how India will be faring in, agreements and so on and so forth, which we are not covering now. But it's still, again, depending on how the policymakers will see the future of India, of Europe, and the two together. We know that negotiations have been going on forever, and they will end somewhere, I'm sure, very shortly. So the floor is yours. Alicia, Huiyao, you want to add something on this very crucial issue?
Yes, I just want to say that reshuffling supply chain does not mean decoupling. Yeah, I mean, it's simply beyond the geopolitical reasons that we may think of for that post-COVID impulse, let's call it, of de-risking that Europe has embarked in. There are literally purely economic reasons not to want to be excessively exposed. And this is like 89% of our solar panels come from China. So, just imagine if there were a single country basically exporting 89% of our oil or our gas. People would say this is an excessive dependence. So the point I want to make here is that it's not about China. We should also realize that even if it were any other country in the world, we would feel excessively dependent, and the reshuffling of supply chains would be thought as a diversification strategy, and we would need to think about decoupling or words that sound very geopolitical. So if we forget all of that, it just makes sense. And in a way, it might make sense even for China. And we see that China is literally already now moving a lot of production into Southeast Asia. In a way, to I would say to diversify away from itself, if you see what I mean. Like not to have a lot of a huge concentration of production for a number of reasons. You could think of environmental reasons, earthquakes. You can think of so many things that would make sense in a way, economically speaking, to just not put all of your eggs in one basket. And therefore, I think we could just leave it there. I mean, we don't need to engage in ideas that we're following the US and this is all political and it's very. It just could be simply an economic move and rational move, therefore.
Alicia for this, and Huiyao, you have the honor of the last sentence in the panel.
Thank you, Alicia. Yeah, no, I think that absolutely, you cannot really against the economic law. You cannot against the market forces. The efficiency, the effectiveness, the cost of production, and all the matters combined, China is still the most ideal place in the world. You have, China's 2/3 of global speed railway. Out of the 10 largest container ports, 7 of them are in China. And on top of that, China every year have produced 12 million college graduates. So where on earth can you find a place? The market is large enough, the middle class is large enough, the market is attractive enough. But also there's one thing I think also, if any company, multinational, can really conquer the China market, they'll conquer the world. This is the first battleground they have to win. So I don't think they can abandon this lucrative market, for their own survival. I mean, just for example, also talk about national security. Apple makes 95% of iPhone in China is used worldwide. Nobody talk about iPhone is not secured or not. So I think also we have to remember economic dangerousness, economic jeopardy is probably one of the most threatening security issue. If we have a really facing the economic slowing down recession, that's probably the biggest threat as all. So we have to really figure that. So China actually, we see the inflation is high in Europe and US because China has kept inflation high. For US, for many countries, US are now adding 350 billion tariffs on China. That's one of the factors contributing to high inflation. So I think after a while, people can try, but they will say, look, we still have the China as the most competitive, most important, and most unavoidable market. We have to live with reality, and we have to survive in this world. So in that sense, I think China can really, in China for China, and also in China for the world, like Tesla is exporting EV cars from China now. So I think this is, we are all intertwined together. There's no difference to differentiate yours, mine. We have to be all humankind all together.
Thank you. Well, let's hope so, because, there are headwinds, compared to what you just said. So, well, we are positive. So, we'll got some time from the next panel. So, I thank our panelists, Françoise, Miguel, Alicia, Huiyao. Thank you for the questions. I'll leave the floor to now my colleague Giulia Sciorati, moderating the second session. And now we will hear from you about what Europe and the US are, reacting, how they are reacting to China. We are looking forward to that. Thank you.
everybody to the second session of our event today. I'm very grateful to have the chance to introduce our second session that is going to be focused on the EU. There is a bit of an echo. I hope we're going to resolve that soon. But we're going to focus on the EU and especially the EU policy towards China today and in the coming months and years after the big hiatus that the COVID pandemic had and the impact that the COVID pandemic had towards relations between the EU and China. I'm particularly grateful to all of our panelists here today and also to Professor Chen, who's connected from China or will be connected soon with us. Without any further ado, I will start introducing our panelists here today in Milan. And first of all, I would like to share a big welcome to Professor Jagannath Panda. We've been corresponding extensively towards the year, and it's nice to finally meet in person. Jagannath is head of the Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs at the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Sweden. We also have here with us Professor Yves Tiberghien, who is professor and Konwakai Chair in Japanese Research at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And here with us in Milan today is also my colleague and friend Filippo Fasulo, who is the co-head of the Geoeconomic Center. He is here at ISPI and also one of the major organizers of this event. Online, I see here with us today Professor Chen Dingding, who is Professor of International Relations at Jinan University and a resident fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. Thank you so much, Professor Chen, for connecting, although the time zone is quite unfortunate for you, so we're very grateful of your participation. So, as I was mentioning at the beginning of our session today, we're going to especially focus towards the EU. And I do have a couple of questions for our panelists just to start the conversation. One thing that, as an observer of China-EU relations, actually had me wonder was the fact that after 3 years, we see that in-person diplomacy had started once more. We had French President Macron visiting China, and Joseph Borrell almost followed suit. Unfortunately, he got a COVID infection and was unable to travel to China. The question that I'm asking myself and that I want to ask our panelists is, well, what kind of China are these policymakers encountering after this 3-year suspension of in-person diplomacy? And whether, in your opinion, in-person diplomacy, these exchanges will have any impact into bettering the relations between the EU, the West, and China at this particular critical juncture. Going against what my predecessor did, I would like to start with asking this question about in-person diplomacy with Professor Chen. So, Professor Chen, if you want to jump in and start our conversation.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you online. Although I cannot be with you in the room, but it's also a great opportunity for me to learn from you. About this question of personal diplomacy, I fully agree that after 3 years of no face-to-face exchanges, this is actually a very good thing, a very positive. We have seen various leaders coming, come to China. French President Macron and other leaders, Brazilian president, and the year before last year, the end of last year, German leader Scholz. So I think it's important to have these face-to-face exchanges for 2 reasons. Number one, we needed to look at each other in the eyes and try to better understand what the intentions of each other, right, are. So we need to understand what are the intentions of our European partners, and European leaders need to understand what are the intentions of Chinese leaders. And this kind of exchange cannot be replaced by online or virtual meetings. They can never be replaced by that. So I think it's actually a very good start to sort of restart this in-person diplomacy after 3 years. And the second reason is, I think, there's a lot of actually misunderstandings and misperceptions between our two sides, between Europe and China. Just one small example, like, how many European students are currently studying in China? A very small number, right? And maybe a good number of Chinese students are still studying at various European universities, which is good. So there's this imbalance between the two sides in terms of international education, and that is very important because without this very in-person and understanding and observation of the reality on the ground for both sides, it's actually very difficult to understand the psychologies of each side. So we read only from newspapers, we read from online contents, so on and so forth. But that's not enough. That's sometimes even misleading and very risky. We try to sometimes we try to see others not as part of our common humanity, but we see others, as different cultures, as different peoples, as different sort of political economic structures. Maybe there is some truth in that, but it's certainly not the whole picture. It's not the whole story. And here in China, in Guangzhou, we as a think tank have co-organized many events with our European partners, like consulates, like cultural organizations. And every event, I would say every event was very successful. And we had guests from all over, mostly China, saying that they wanted to learn more about Europe and about other cultures and other systems. So I think this kind of in-person, leadership exchange would reduce some of the misunderstandings, not all of them, of course. So that's very, very positive, and will also bring some confidence to both sides. So we know we actually share some, common concerns like climate change, energy transition, and global security and the global development, and so on and so forth. And I believe this year we're going to see more and more such in-person diplomacy. And we certainly hope there'll be more also between China and the US. And that's another story. Stop here for the moment. Thank you.
To now pass the floor to Professor Tiberghien. I know that you are very close with EU institutions, and so you can tell us something about what's the expectations of this in-person diplomacy in the EU.
Thank you, Juliana, and it's great following up on what Professor Chen Dingding said. I will echo what was said in the sense that we have found with COVID that real diplomacy doesn't work. Even within the EU, when they try to do by Zoom, the convergence on COVID policy, it failed initially, and it's only when it was an in-person summit in July 2020 that the breakthrough happened. So across the board, and we have seen this with the G20. The G20 was critical in November, and it was the G20, but there were also a couple hundred bilateral meetings, and the Chinese president alone had 14 bilaterals, including a couple at Apex sidelines. So those things are absolutely critical. They diffuse misperceptions, they diffuse crisis, they share information. So all this is correct. And I know that the approach of the EU in this regard is indeed different from the one of the US. And I should add Canada, since I come from Canada. We have seen now a flurry of visits by leaders from Europe, and we're not seeing the equivalent from the US or from Canada, not even Japan, right? So it's interesting the positioning here that EU plays at that moment. So I will say that first, and I think, in general, the EU positioning, what has come out, especially from Josep Borrell, who has, in a way, the mandate to represent the EU foreign policy. So we have to always take, what an individual leader like President Macron says into a larger context, whereas what comes out of Borrell tends to be this integration of a lot of information from a lot of parts of the EU and different countries. And so the general approach is they want to uphold a rules-based order. They want to advance certain, they solve certain problems. There's a lot of concern in the EU on Ukraine. I mean, there's been this misunderstanding around Ukraine for a year and a half now between China and the EU. In several EU-China summits, the Chinese side would say, we don't need to talk about this. This is a security issue. This is not about EU-China. Let's talk about business. Let's talk about human relations. Let's talk about climate. And then the EU would always come back and say, Ukraine is European security, is the heart of our survival. You can't ignore it. And Borrell has said there's a red line. If China supplies weapons, it will deeply transform in a negative way the EU-China relations. So, those misunderstandings, it does help to talk, but it has a huge effect. I should, in terms of a structural context, I should add to answer the full length of your question that the European leaders and others who are now returning to China or restarting relationships, they're constrained by three new realities that are pretty profound. One is the Chinese domestic context. The second one is the China-US context, which affects everything else. And the third is certain aspect of the EU-China structure. But on the Chinese context, we can just mention a couple things, maybe three things. The first one is the legacy of the zero COVID post-March 2022. So I happen to have done a book on Asia's approaches to COVID policy. And China has had several phases, but in March 2022, the leadership in China chose to ignore the advice from scientists in China. There was a committee formed at the top level that gave advice on the gradual reopening, how to deal with Omicron. And instead, the solution has been to crack down extremely harshly on COVID through escalation of digital testing and daily tests. And then eventually, people were locked down in Shanghai. People had no food and the like. And so, having talked to a lot of people, I could see that experience of being completely locked down for months and under digital testing every day was very traumatizing, right? The middle class got very angry all across China. And the world watching this, including Europeans, were quite shocked, right, by how far it could go. That human experience has had some profound impact because it made everybody wake up about what does it say about China. This is not the China of Deng Xiaoping, not the China of Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin, right? This is, there was some Maoist component in the way the enforcement was. And so that forces anyone now dealing with China to reflect about why it was so harsh, right? Only in 2022, I'm not talking 2020 and 2021. The second aspect was the 20th Party Congress, which has led to a different China. Usual factional politics has been overridden. There has been extreme centralization of power. And so what we used to teach about China in the post-Deng period has been changed. It's a different China, and there is more fear of groupthink. There is a fear that there's less diversity of advice given to the top leadership. And so when there's groupthink, then when you meet the counterpart, there is a bit more concern, right? There is that reality. Now, it's also true that since December, there's a general reopening of China, especially even the G20. That was the starting point. And we see a return to some rational economic policymaking and international economic policy. But there's still elements of ideological rigidity. So whoever now deals with China has to see, am I seeing the old economic rationality of a reformist China, or do I see the elements of ideological rigidity that we saw in the last few years? And there's always that uncertainty, right? Which China are we talking to? The second big factor, structural factor, is the US-China whatever we call it, strategic competition. There is a very serious piece in the Financial Times today by Martin Wolf, the longtime economic editor. And, essentially in Washington, there is a consensus that, essentially this is a very serious strategic competition. And everyone in Washington, not only, and unlike Europe, not only wants to force China to obey to general rules, they also want to stop the rise of China. You know, China has reached 80% of US GDP. That's why they want to stop it, right? It's seen, the US view is that maintaining US preeminence is critical. And so that's a very, very, you could say aggressive position, but it's treacherous, right? And that's why there's this warning from Martin Wolf and many others. We're entering a period where there's securitization and weaponization of exchange. And we see momentum in a tit-for-tat acceleration. So there's all kinds of actions taken by one side, the other side responds very strongly, then the first side sees this as aggressive, it responds even more strongly, and that momentum is like a vortex, right? It's having huge impact with huge speed and velocity. So many, many things are happening every week that would normally happen every 20 years. And so everyone else, like Europe, is forced to take into account this accelerating vortex of EU-China relations. So that's something we're forced to keep in mind. And that leads us to Europe. What does Europe see then? What is Europe's interest? And so, well, what we get from Borrell's speech, but also from von der Leyen and from other speakers, Europe is ill at ease, right? Because Europe is not a massive military power. But Europe's interest in general is in pushing back on certain differences that it has with China while maintaining a global order and preventing war. So there is that very difficult positioning at the time of geopolitical tensions. And so, yeah, Europe is interested in rules of coexistence, common guardrails, systemic cooperation, etc. And an understanding that the G7 cannot rule alone. There's also the whole issue of dealing with the global south, and avoiding a pure descent into a tit-for-tat cycle. So I would be a little less rosy than the first panel was. There's a lot of geopolitics going very, very fast right now.
Thank you very much for this overview, and especially for taking us through these different units of analysis of the current China-EU relations. And we would like to ask the same question about what China is in-person diplomacy experiencing today to our Professor Panda. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here, and thanks to Fabio and ISPI for this invitation. And nice to meet, quite a lot of friends out here with whom I'm communicating for a long time. My first visit, but thoroughly enjoying this discussion. I think how the China-EU relations is going to evolve. I'm an outsider. For last 1 year, I'm here, and let me share my experience, how I am looking at the things. I think in order to understand how the China-EU relation is going to evolve, we need to review some of these basic questions. And I think the first basic questions is from the panel one, that will China ever return or come back more seriously or more prominently? I think that question has, I would like to see that question slightly differently. I would see that China never left. The pandemic only created a divide. But if you see in terms of foreign policy, in terms of security outlook, in terms of outreach, China was always there. Even though the pandemic created that barrier between China and the rest of the world, there was no travel. And today also the Chinese are just beginning welcoming the guests inside China, and the Chinese leadership has started traveling. But then the Chinese have never left. In fact, if you study the behavior of China during the pandemics, truly, there was world fourier diplomacy strategy they implemented. They started engaging with the world more aggressively. If we talk about the neighborhood, India, South Asia, South China Sea, there was more activities were happening during the pandemic and immediately after the pandemic. Take the example of India. During the pandemic, we saw the intensification of the boundary dispute with India only went to the next level. So China actually never left the world politics. China is a huge country. We know in Shanghai has some of the finest international banks headquarters. China has more international banks throughout China. China's outreach and diplomacy, embassies all over the world is very well known, including in Europe. If we compare the largest populous country with India today, India even doesn't have so much embassies around the world. So I think this is just a misnomer to say that China has left and China will come back, but I do see it, China has never left. So coming back to the Europe, I think China is still a very critical and the most influential actor in Europe. And it is going to be emerging the most influential actor in times to come. Now, I will answer why do I say that. I think if we see during the pandemic or during the war, if any country which has lost its face or lost its most of the influence or the goodwill in Euro regions, that is China. Because of China's eloquent and open support to the Russians, I think the Chinese have got a very bad image in Europe at this moment. Of course, not all the countries are against China, but I think overall China has lost a face because of the Russia-Ukraine war. And I think the Chinese would like to make that, like to overcome that difficulty. They would like to rebuild their image, what they have lost during the war. So I think the Chinese are going to, when it comes to their political outreach, in terms of diplomatic skills and diplomatic outreach, you will see, even though we have seen that there has been a reduction from 17+1 to 14+1, we know that the post-pandemic economic order, as we discussed, we need China. And I think the Euro region is no exception. Europe will need China as much as the rest of the world wants it. The second thing is, I think, what about the Chinese approach, diplomatic approach, and what would be China's future approach towards EU, European Union as a whole? I think, the French president's visit to China has given a lot of answer. And that itself not only has given a kind of comfort to China to think about, how to go about it. I think this has been in some ways a boost for the Chinese, what they were searching for or looking for. Of course, I do understand from the background how Macron pitched this view, but then the perception of his view has been mistreated, and the perception of his view has been acted as a boost for the Chinese outreach plan. Now, strategic autonomy is a concept which is visible in many countries' foreign policy, including in Indian foreign policy. And I think many countries' foreign policy has that contradiction of dealing with China. To see China as a threat, or to see China just as a concern, or to see China as an economic opportunity. In India, also the same debate continues. And I think, I have been studying about China and India for almost close to 20 years now, more than 1.5 decades, been a member of the experts group. I would say the same dilemma existed 15, 17 years, and that dilemma is only going to intensify. Even though India has stopped, India has banned some of the Chinese applications, mind it. I think during the pandemic, during the Ukraine-Russia war, India-China bilateral trade and economy has only gone up. So we have to be realistic. The Chinese outreach, the Chinese economic diplomacy, Chinese positioning in world politics is so strong, it is almost impossible to put a full stop. And Eurozone is no exception to that. So therefore, I would say the China's future approach towards EU would be largely much more collaborative, cooperative, in order to rebuild its outreach and rebuild its lost ground that it has faced during it. And I think, how do I see China seeing at the conflicting issues, particularly the Ukraine crisis to other issues? I think it largely also depends how Chinese are perceiving this war. In fact, if you see the Russia-Ukraine war, if any country which has drawn heavy lessons from the war, and any country which is observing very closely the Russia-Ukraine war, that is China, because it has obvious interest. When the war started, there was already an alarm that Taiwan is going to happen next. And today also that debate exists. But I think any country which has drawn serious lesson and not going to do the same mistake, it is China. I think during the course of the war, the Chinese have drawn heavy operational learning, heavy strategic learning, military learning. Earlier, the Chinese were thinking to occupy Taiwan is going to be
very easy. Today, I think the Chinese are reviewing their game plan. It's not going to be that easy. Taiwan is going to fight back, and there will be a mini-scale war in the region, if not leading to a world war. So I think the Chinese are preparing for that, and they are not going to do the mistake that President Putin did attacking on Ukraine. And I think that is the serious lessons the China. What about China-India boundary dispute and other major conflicts, including the South China Sea? I don't really see the South China Sea intensifying at this moment, because the Chinese larger aim under Xi Jinping is the Taiwan crisis, the Taiwan issue rather than the South China issue. And when it comes to China-India boundary dispute, it's just a small issue for the Chinese. The Chinese are not really interested on intensifying the China-India boundary dispute. The Chinese are intensifying the China-India boundary dispute for a simple reason. They want to signal multiple messages to many countries in Asia and around the world that they are still an aggressive and assertive power. They can teach any country, including a country which is rising, that is India. They can pressurize a rising country and most important country in the Indo-Pacific regions whenever they want. So even though during the pandemic we saw that the Chinese were creating, of course there are tactical issues, practical issues involved in it. The Chinese were trying to change the status quo on the boundary dispute. That has been a classical trend over the last 2-3 years. But the broader signaling is to position China much more effectively when it comes to the neighborhood. So therefore my last point here would be, when it comes to the near neighborhood regions, the Chinese would be much more assertive, much more aggressive. But when it comes to the far abroad regions like the EU or the European Union, the Chinese would like to regain their lost ground, what they have faced during the pandemic or during the war. So China's approach towards the Europe is only going to go to the next level. Maybe we might not really see this momentum building up immediately in next few months, but eventually it will take off and China will emerge as a bigger actor than earlier in the Euro region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Filippo, let me twitch a bit the overall question that I asked to everybody else, just to follow up on Professor Panda's remarks. Do you share this view about this dual approach that China has will prospectively adopt with the neighborhood and Europe, especially with regards to this posture, more like security-oriented? Or do you have a different perspective towards this?
So thank you, Julian. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Of course, we do believe a lot in in-person diplomacy. That's why we invited you, and we promise Professor Chen Dingding next time we'll find a way to have you here in person. So we do believe in it. So coming to your question, I agree on the fact that China might have a different approach with neighbor and other and foreign countries and far countries, or further countries, I would say. But I think the most important thing, and I think is the most important result of 3 years of COVID plus war, is that probably the Chinese now are well aware of the fact that we are in a kind of age of competition. I think this is the most important thing. So while we are still debating, of course, we are, even us, so we are asking ourselves if we have to rethink Europeans' view toward China, and if it's the systemic rivalry to prevail, or we have to go back to the cooperation or the partnership. The Chinese for sure knows that we are in the age of competition, as the Americans present in the national defense strategy. And being in an age of competition means that decoupling is here and is an issue, and trade won't be back at the usual system it was before. That's something for true. And another thing that the war added to a complicated situation is that now to say exactly who is your friend, who is not your friend, it's become something explicit, no longer only implicit. This is the difference, I think. And actually, it's something the Chinese were well aware, of course, already in the year before, just before the wars. Let's think about the dual circulation strategy. The dual circulation strategy means to add a strategic view on Chinese economy, means to be sure, means to try to preserve Chinese economy from strategic decision by other countries. This something means that you are aware of that there is a competition. And the second point is the famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, of the no limit friendship between China and Russia on February the 4th at the start of the Beijing Olympic Games. It means that we know we are in a competition. It means we are no longer hiding the fact that we are in a competition with the US, because that friendship stays for the fact that they are competing, they are rival with the existing world order. And let's see at the other point of view, from the American side, from the Western side, and from their possible allies. I was quite surprised by the result of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, because the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, now it is not any proper economic result, any proper economic reality. At this point is, most of all, a political statement saying we want to start together and to negotiate a kind of agreement to find a way to contain China. And there are many countries writing down on the paper that their signature on saying, yes, we do agree that there should be a new economic order, a new economic framework that might contain China. So that means the competition has become explicit, not only implicit as it was before at the beginning. And the other side, again, if we were deciding there was, maybe on the background an idea of competing the Western-led, the liberal world order, after the war, after the friendship with no limits between China and Russia, we can see, and again, it's quite surprising, maybe 1 year ago, nobody would expect what we are seeing now, for example, with BRICS, and the possibility of BRICS expansion, with 11 countries, as announced a couple of days ago, announcing that we want to join a group, that this group has as its foundation meaning to say there is another world but the Western-led world. So this is something quite easy, let's say. This is a major challenge, a major shift, a major difference of the world we were experiencing 3 years ago. And Europe, of course, need to face this kind of environment, that is, I would say, even more fragmented. And stay with the coupling. I always quite puzzled about the discussion about decoupling, de-risking, or diversifying. I think they're the same thing. It is a kind of a different degree of what you do. The point is the idea of decoupling, so the idea that trade cannot solve everything is the input. There is the input, now you need to decouple, but the problem is we don't know what is going to be the output. So there's not going to be zeroing the trade relation between two countries, but we are seeing different results, like, for example, a shift to investment, shift to production capacity, either from the Western countries and China to Southeast Asia. And we still don't know what is going on. We don't know how, so we're in the middle of the process, still without no solution. The basic point, I said, is we should realize, as many already said, that we are in the age of competition. China knows it quite well, and now everything we do in terms of economics can be leveraged strategically. That's the main point.
Thank you very much, Filippo. And well, building up on this major takeaway that I think came across the speeches and the remarks of all our speakers, that we are in this age of competition and this systemic rivalry is actually informing EU-China relations today and will be in the future. I would like to ask a second question to our panelists, and I invite them to be as brief as possible so that we're going to have a discussion afterwards. In their history, China-EU relations have always been able to grow and rely on sanctuaries, so to speak. So topics that have been considered safe and that had been able to start the conversation between China and the EU. Green development, the environment and climate, just to make some examples. I was wondering, in this particular context that we are today, what do you think are the sanctuaries left to China-EU relations today? And again, I would like to begin with Professor Chen.
Well, thank you. I think I agree with some of the previous speakers, their comments that EU-China relations actually in a way very different from US-China relations for several reasons, for both geopolitical reasons and economic reasons. So I think what we have inherited from before is actually quite a solid relationship between the two in terms of economic relationship and also in terms of cultural exchange and in terms of geopolitical situation. So I think even in a way, it's fundamentally different from U.S.-China relationship. So EU-China relationship certainly cannot be defined by one word, competition. Even though we all talk about the competition today, I think that's really kind of misleading. EU-China trade is still at a very high level and will continue to grow, particularly in the green energy sector and so on and so forth. And there's no like any sort of kind of a discussion of a military conflict between EU and China, right? That is very different from a U.S.-China relationship, right? Nobody serious would be talking about a potential military conflict between EU and China. So we have peace and stability in this very important relationship. So that I think that's partly a result of the past 40 years of engagement. And the EU leaders from France, Germany, and to other countries continue to stress the importance of various forms of engagement with China, even though the word engagement might not be the most frequently mentioned word in the narratives today, but still the essence is still a kind of engagement. So I think this all of these developments from the past decades, I think give us a lot of confidence in terms of understanding the future of EU-China relations. And I think European leaders are also beginning to understand this. They wanted to have a certain degree of strategic autonomy or independence, precisely because the U.S., for example, domestic politics is very, very unpredictable. We are entering another presidential cycle very soon in the U.S., and who knows what will happen to the U.S. next presidential election. We know at least that Donald Trump is not going away quietly, even though he might not be winning the presidential election this year, but his supporters and his and like-minded candidates could very well end up entering the White House next year. If that happens, I'm sure that would raise some very serious questions for our European colleagues. And where's the U.S. headed? And how should we balance the future of U.S. Domestic politics, so on and so forth. So I think EU is doing the right things at this moment, maintaining both a good relationship with the U.S. and also a working relationship, a mature relationship with China, and also India. And by the way, is playing its position very, very well. So I think all this again would bring us be positive global peace and stability. Europe, EU as a whole is making a big contribution to global stability and peace. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen. Professor Taibergian, the floor is yours.
All right, so I'll be short. So there are a few good stories, and they're pretty striking. The obvious one that everybody talks about is about the environment, but it's worth emphasizing that the December Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was officially chaired by China, although hosted by Canada in the context of COVID, led to a very strong agreement with 23 targets, and there was very strong EU leadership in this and very strong cooperation with China. It's worth noting that as part of the CBD, the US is not there. So there was no such rivalry US-China at the heart of those negotiations. But I've talked with the UN Rapporteur for Environment and Human Rights. They were very happy that even indigenous rights were strongly recognized. Everything that most people on the environmental side and the human rights side were hoping for are in the agreement. Very serious targets. It's a very interesting milestone. What's interesting, by the way, it may not be known, but some of the negotiators on the Chinese side were trained in the EU. One I had as a former student when I was teaching in the past. And also that there was a decision made on the Chinese side to go full out on the cooperative side, and the Minister of Environment is a true believer in this issue, and he had the full mandate from the top. So that's a good story. The story was reiterated with the treaties for high seas protection in February. In a way, it was enabled by the success on the biodiversity negotiations. And by the way, again, it's under UNCLOS, so it's interesting because China has had issues with UNCLOS, but here, China was a full cooperative player. I've been able to debrief with negotiators from other countries, not China and not US, but top negotiators that were present, and they were positive on both biodiversity and ocean on the role played by China in general. Then we have good momentum right now for pandemic treaty in Geneva, and what I'm hearing from top negotiators, non-Chinese, but not, that China's role is cooperative. And there is progress. And then there is the big one, in a sense the EU and China have common ground, at least in believing in the need for maintaining strong, robust global institutions of the global order. So they wouldn't agree on the political side, democracy, human rights, but there's agreement on, say, trade. So when the US blocked the appointment of judges at the appellate body, in the EU and Canada worked with something called the Ottawa Group to create an alternative for the dispute settlement. And it became the MPIA, which is a big mediation, a multilateral mediation agreement. And the surprise was that when it was signed, China was a signatory, even though it was not part of the Ottawa Group. So between the negotiation at Ottawa Group and then the formal opening of that agreement, China joined. Japan, which was in the Ottawa Group, did not sign, but joined last month. So now Japan is part of it. So what I'm hearing from very top people is that now we have effective trade settlement, dispute settlement, as long as it doesn't involve the US, but it does involve China. So it's an interesting one because for the EU, the WTO is very, very important. And at the institutional level, at least, the Chinese side is on board. Now, we should add to that Josep Borrell, in his speech at the CCG, in absentia, mentioned upfront that while we agree together on WTO, we share this, etc., we have a huge imbalance in trade. It's 400 billion euros deficit last year, which is correlated to lack of a level playing field in China. That is, Chinese, European companies just don't have a fair access to many markets in China or approval. So Borrell did a warning and said, we'll maintain this as long as we progress together in solving that level playing field problem. Otherwise, we'll have to take strong counter moves. So that there is an interesting warning here in Borrell's speech. We can add the G20. China again played, don't know if it's well known, but in Bali, after the war in Ukraine, there was fear that G20 would collapse because the G7 countries plus Australia, Korea did not want to meet Putin there. And the others, the global South countries, wanted to not change the G20. They didn't want to expel a major country like Russia. So there was all this complicated negotiation. In the end, Putin did not come, even though he was invited. That was the brilliance of the Indonesian presidency. But the big surprise on site is that China cooperated with Europe and even US in the G20 and did not back Russia in any way in Bali. And so the inside stories, if you talk to negotiators I'm not asking Chinese or Americans, but others, the surprise was, again, when Lavrov spoke, there was no support given to the position by the Chinese top representative. And inside the negotiations, in fact, there was some criticism from China toward Russia, and there was support by the Chinese for the Article 3 and 4 of the G20 Declaration, which are very strong in condemning the war and its impact, and also Article 4, strong warning against the use of nuclear weapons. So China has fully worked with Europe on the nuclear weapon warning and on, in Bali. Now, it's interesting that in Delhi, at the foreign minister meeting, China shifted position and at that point supported Russia. So there has been a shift. I guess for me, the shift is related to the deterioration of US-China relations. Because for China, everything is about the US, and in particular, the relation with Russia is only as a hedge against the US. So when the US is escalating measures against China, China responds by, in this case, the G20, by siding back with Russia. But so all those things were common. And on Ukraine, it's worth noting that the French-Chinese declaration during Macron, so not the speech in the plane, right, but the actual declaration, very thorough, and it has all kind of very interesting commitments by both countries, so including China, against nuclear weapons, on the protection of civilians, on protection of international rules of war. There's certain things like this that are quoted in that declaration. Where there seems to be common ground, right? But Ukraine remains a sensitive issue. It's a red line. Again, if there is supply of weapons, that would break the relation between EU and China. So it's sensitive in that sense. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. And in 5 minutes, Professor Panda, what do you think is going to be driving China-EU relations in the near future?
I think there are 2-3 issues we need to revisit. One is China's perception towards the Indo-Pacific. I think if any country outside the Indo-Pacific or any country which is a major power in world politics understand the politics of Indo-Pacific very clearly, that is China. For last 2 decades, they have been observing the developments in the Indo-Pacific region, even though Indo-Pacific is just a new conception which is there for last few years or 1 decade. But if we see the Chinese writings, Ranpin Repao, 2003, they published an editorial which said that US is trying to establish an Asian NATO. So the Chinese have been the first reader about the Indo-Pacific game plan long time back, 2 decades back. Now, why I'm mentioning this? Because I think China understand that EU is a region which is showing a lot of inclination towards Indo-Pacific. But at present, there is no clarity. And that would drive China to reach to the EU member states much more clearly, much more prominently in times to come, so that they can create that necessary division that is required. And that will pull out EU strategy not to really be very effective in the Indo-Pacific regions. That would be one driver behind why China would be reaching more towards EU. The second is that I think what the Chinese understand at this moment is that the lack of real chemistry that exists between EU and US. And I think that is another factor that the Chinese they have seen during the AUKUS, how AUKUS was received in the pan-European regions, and how France reacted to it. And I think some of these issues would be very closely observed by the Chinese, and they would like to capitalize on some of these issues. And therefore, we will see that once the pandemic is really completely going down, and once we are into the process, in a year or 2, you will see Chinese coming back and trying to revitalize the 17+1 network and trying to propose new grounds for the belt, enhancing the Belt and Road initiatives. So the whole idea is to position itself in EU in such a way where there will be a challenge to the US outreach in the region in some ways, and also to create that necessary division that is required, EU not as a united formula to reach to the Indo-Pacific regions. The third issue is, I think, the very existence of limitations within the China-Russia, that no-limit partnerships. And I think the Chinese know that there is every kind of limitations are there. And Russians too know that there are every kind of limitations. And if we see this issue, I think on the practical terms, there are 2-3 issues immediately. One is that the Chinese do not want Russia to come to the Southeast Asia so easily. And today the Chinese realize that Russia is going to be in economic crisis. They would be needing on Southeast Asian supply chains and trade and economies to boost their food supply chains to economic recovery. So the Chinese would not really allow that. Second, when it comes to the Eurasian and the South Asian regions, the Chinese are not really comfortable Russia dominating or trying to reshape their relationship. So in the biggest drawback in China-Russia relationship is that Russia wants a multipolar Eurasia, whereas China wants a unipolar Eurasia. Because having a unipolar Eurasia is a next step to China's rise in global politics, and that will provide a huge gateway to China's outreach in Europe. So therefore, the Chinese would not really provide that necessary fillip that Russia is requiring post the war, be it economic recovery or their food supply chain, and the Chinese are very good in punishing the Russians. They have been doing it for some time in their name of good partners, good neighbors, good friends, and I think they will continue to do that. So I think these are the issues which will encourage, and these are the background drivers which is clearly visible, and why therefore I say that China is going to emerge as a much more effective and decisive power in the EU framework in times to come.
Thank you very much for this sharp analysis. And Filippo, I know that from previous conversations, I know that you share some of the drivers that Professor Panda actually mentioned, especially with regards to the Indo-Pacific. Care to explain to us what do you think the future of sanctuaries of China-EU relations will be?
Yes, thanks. One, of course, is the Indo-Pacific strategy. They can see European Indo-Pacific strategy has two main drivers. One is, of course, a kind of containment of China, so a kind of try to find a way to review the relation with China and maybe more in line with the US view. You can see, for example, how the Czech presidency, Czech rotating presidency, organized its own event on Indo-Pacific. US was there, NATO was there, and all the debate was how to react against autocracies in the world. Of course, we were in the middle of the first phase of the Russian invasion to Ukraine. But then there is another dimension. Another dimension I think is quite interesting as well. It is trying to engage more with the Southeast Asian, with the Pacific region, economically engage with the region. And it probably was much more what the French presidency presented on its event on February the 22nd, 2022. Very unlucky timing because of the war that started a couple of days after that. But I want to add something more. I think that probably the biggest driver for EU-China relationship in the next 5 to 10 years will be the cost of diversification, the cost of decoupling, the cost of de-risking. So I think that the EU Commission, or at least at the level of EU Commission, they agreed on the fact that we as Europeans need to diversify. And we can see tons of documents on that, tons of documents on Critical Material Act, Chips Act, batteries and whatever. And all these documents, they have in mind to review our relation with the country from which we are dependent, and this country most of the time, 99% of the time, is China. And so there is a clear idea. What's the problem? The problem is what we already said before, that to diversify, decouple, or the risk from China is too costly. And this will create, is already creating division between EU and the US on the cost, on the sustainability for Europe to do what the Americans are doing, especially because Europe is already, in the case, really decoupling from the Russian energy. But there are also divisions between European countries. Let's see the race between France and Germany to probably to have a better political relation with China in order to gain some economic profit for their own country. And there is another point. There are differences within countries between sectors that can gain more staying connected with China or a sector that can gain more decoupling or diversifying from China. So this is going to be the major driver. Depends on the moment and on the cost of this kind of diversification, the relation with China will be different. If the cost will be reduced, Europe probably will be more independent and more aligned with the US. If the cost, because of many other costs, many other disruption across the world will be higher, you will try to stay closer with China because not able to sustain the cost of it.
Thank you very much, Filippo. And we are already a bit over time, but I would like to take 5 more minutes for questions. And while you gather your thoughts, I would just like to say and remind everyone that you can read a bit of the opinion of our panelists in the newly published report by ISPI, and that you can find on the ISPI website. And it's open access, so have a look. All of our panelists actually contributed to the report. I'm now opening the floor for questions. Please go ahead.
Thank you. In our lifetime period, is there the possibility for the EU to be united, a united and independent third actor between Washington and Beijing or not? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Who cares to start? Please go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So we know the obstacles, right? There are lots of obstacles, lots of cleavages in the EU, east-west, north-south, and everything, and lots of structural and legal obstacles. Now, on the other side, there is a strategic reality that we have a very intense geopolitical confrontation between giants. So that there is a structural force that if the EU doesn't get together, it will become not just irrelevant, it will be lunch. It will be lunch for the giants. So I think that reality is pretty heavy, and it has led to significant changes. That is what the EU has done over the last, even the last year, would have totally been unpredictable. For example, a common platform for sourcing weapons for supporting Ukraine, right? That has been never touched before territory. And I would, we used to score the level of integration of EU policy from 1 to 5. There was a famous book by Peterson. So trade is a 5, is fully integrated, whereas traditionally, legal system or foreign policy with great power, it was more like a 1. It's intergovernmental. Well, I think we just witnessed the EU moving from 1 to 2.5 on relation with great powers such as Russia, maybe a 3 even, and in fact China under our own eyes. There's a massive change in the EU right now. Now, will it go all the way to what you described, that part? We see major change, and the EU only changes when it's under the gun, under huge threat. And so the more threats there will be, the more there will be this amazing capacity. I tend to be optimistic, but the opinion polls also remarkable. The Eurobarometer, all over, it has gone much, has improved very much from 2-3 years ago. In general, there's support for even the support for the EU policy on Ukraine, like 60%. There is stronger support for the euro all over, including in countries that suffered 10 years ago, and so on, right? So there are some positive forces there. But nothing is given, right? It's a depend kind of answer.
Thank you so much. Professor Chen, would you like to try and answer this question yourself? 1 minute each.
Well, it's a tough question. As an outsider, so I can only speculate and say things that could be wrong. And I agree with you that it's very possible that EU would get stronger and more united because of external situation, threats, or something else. It's not easy, but the past 50 or 60 years of European integration has never been easy, right? So I think this is normal, and I think at least one thing we can be sure: EU today is more united and stronger than it was 1 year ago. So I think that pattern could potentially continue. One thing, though, is I think whether eventually EU would develop a full sense of strategic autonomy. I think not so aligned with the US, not so close to China, but being EU itself. I think that's the biggest question, in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And some final remarks from Professor Panda and Filippo as well.
Very shortly, I do see, I think, domestically, EU will continue to struggle on various political issues, but institutionally, it will be stronger and bigger. There will be a lot of legal reforms, institutional mechanisms coming up within EU. So we will see EU moving forward and as a united club. But there will be so much domestic problems because of the war effect, because of the domestic crises that are there existing within EU for a long time. What about the foreign policy outreach or the EU's engagement with the rest of the world? I think in EU's engagement with Asia and Indo-Pacific is going to be larger, and EU will see structurally getting engaged in many ways with the major countries as well as middle income and minor economies. But while saying that, I think on critical determining issues which are conflict-prone issues, you will never have a united position or a united stand. EU will continue to have a united voice there, and I think that will be the major drawback. Even though today we do see EU will have an effective outreach towards Indo-Pacific, it will never have a united effective outreach towards Indo-Pacific, particularly towards the conflicting issues.
Thank you. Filippo?
So being with you, the only insider in Europe of this panel, I would say that actually we won't see any fully united Europe by our lifetime. I think it's the beauty of Europe, European Union. We have a very diverse position, and this is the strength in some way of Europe. The point is, the question is, if we are going to create our own identity separated from that of the US, that would be one major point, especially if we start to become more and more marginal in the global discourse, and the American policies are not that much aligned with the EU one. So this would be probably a major change and something that will force European Union to be more united and that. So otherwise, if we can be, as it was in the past, free rider for a US strategy, will be more and more diverse and with no need to be more united and any more than that.
Thank you very much. I would like to just take the chance to thank all the speakers, all the audience, our partners in this event, Elcano and CCG, as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the support to host these sessions today. Thank you very much, and I will close the event here.